Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will step into a bridal chamber, but not the lavish, romantic kind you read about in fairy tales. Imagine this flickering candlelight, casting shadows on the gilded walls of the Royal Palace of Madrid. The faint scent of incense trying to mask the dampness in the air, and a princess only 16 years old, sitting at the edge of the bed, clutching her rosary as if it were the only weapon to protect her. She had been raised in a convent, sheltered from the outside world, and no one had ever told her what would happen on her wedding night. Outside, the soft footsteps of the ladies in waiting faded away, leaving her alone with her fears. Then, the door opened. What entered was not a charming prince from a dream, but a man nearly twice her age, reeking of wine, full of power, and carrying within him a deformity so grotesque it would make history shudder. Within minutes, this marriage would turn into one of the most humiliating, bizarre, and infamous wedding nights ever recorded, a night so horrifying that even the Pope himself was forced to intervene. You hold your breath ever so quietly. In the bridal chamber, the candles still flicker, as if undecided whether to reveal everything clearly or remain dim, so that the heart might fear less. On the walls, tapestries woven with the pattern of the cross glimmer and fade with each breeze slipping through the tall window frames. The 16-year-old bride still sits motionless at the edge of the bed, the cold rosary pressing into her palm. The fear has no name, for no one had ever taught her how to name it, rising like water, flooding her throat until each breath of air becomes hard to swallow. The heavy door closed behind the king. From that moment, the space in the room seemed to shrink. The blessings of the afternoon, the brass trumpets in the courtyard, the murmurs of diplomatic envoys, all suddenly belonged to another world. Here, there were only two people. One held the power of life and death over a kingdom. One had just left the convent, not yet understanding life. She raised her eyes, then looked down immediately, feeling as if the ground had slipped beneath her feet. Her long lashes trembled. Broken prayers lingered on her lips. No one knows which sound shattered the silence first. Perhaps the clumsy, dragging footsteps. Perhaps the wheezing breath of someone who had been drinking. Perhaps the heartbeat of the bride herself, pounding so loudly in her tiny chest that she thought the entire room must hear it. Then everything happened too quickly to imagine an awkward gesture, an instinctive recoil, a sudden stumble against the bedpost. And after that, complete bewilderment. It is only known that she panicked so much that her own body betrayed her. The marriage bed, which should have symbolized a beginning, suddenly became the clearest mirror of truth. This was no fairy tale. The door burst open. The ladies in waiting rushed in, then froze, as if afraid to touch the air itself. No one dared to ask. No one dared to look directly. They hurried to draw the curtains, change the sheets, clear away what could be cleared. One brought a cloth to the bride, her hands trembling. Another whispered, "It's all right. It's all right." But even that voice faltered. Meanwhile, the king had already left, leaving behind an underground storm that would last for many years to come. The next morning, the palace felt like an enormous ear. Every wall knew. Every corridor listened. Silence hung heavy as lead. Calculating glances were exchanged in ceremonial halls. Whispered words dropped like pins, only to be instantly swept away by courtly etiquette. Yet news always finds a way to right itself. The closest servants knew better than anyone. They saw the bride pale, praying longer than usual. They saw the king's breakfast untouched. They saw the second, the third night, the bridal chamber still as cold as a chapel at dawn. You follow the story out of that chamber into the labyrinth of power, where one failed night could become the lever of an entire court. For here, private happiness was never private. It was state business. Theology. Succession law. The safety of a nation just emerging from historical earthquakes. Madrid that year still reeked of Napoleonic wars, still bore fractures between royalists and liberals, between tradition and change. A weary dynasty stepped into the 19th century, gazing at the throne as if at an anchor. But that anchor now dangled from a failed wedding night. They summoned a confessor, old, calm, his words seasoned by 100 Lents. He sat across from the young bride, not questioning, only telling. He spoke of marriage as a sacrament. He spoke of the union both holy and carnal by the design of the Creator. He spoke of the duty of heirs as a vocation bound to the crown. He did not force, nor coax. He was tender, yet firm, as if guiding someone across a narrow bridge. On the other side of that bridge lay the adult reality that love in the Forbidden City was seldom love, that royal marriage was above all an equation of succession. Then came the letters back and forth between Madrid and Rome, between throne and papacy, between the will of God and the will of man. In them, words were chosen like stitches delicate, precise, percent. Rome reminded of marital doctrine, reminded that conjugal union was rightful and necessary. Madrid replied that the heart of a young girl was still in the convent, and her mind needed to be uplifted to step into the light of a new life. No one wrote the thing both sides understood, that a papal seal might dispel some mist, but could not replace one hand reaching for another. The following days passed like a taut thread. Each evening, the court orchestra still played. Gowns still rustled across marble. Noble women still wore pearls so heavy their spines had to adjust. Yet in a hidden corner, the 16-year-old bride kept relearning everything: how to breathe slowly, how to face a husband, both powerful and alien, how to lay her hands in prayer, and beg herself not to tremble anymore. The king too learned, in the way of a man accustomed to command, that some doors only open when you cease pounding. He knocked, slow, steady, and strangely, with fewer words. But fear has a long memory. It remembers the first time someone called your name, remembers the scent of that night, remembers the crackle of the burning candles, remembers even the touch of the cold bed frame against the knee. And the bride's fear, therefore, was not merely fear of one man. It was fear of an entire mechanism pushing her forward. Fear of the watching eyes. Fear of the golden pedestal that turned a human being into a symbol. Every word of comfort, if spoken clumsily, drove in another nail, and every thought of escape, if not carried far enough, only tightened the chest like a rope being pulled. One morning, a delegation from Germany arrived. Their bows measured to perfection, their courtesies balanced exactly. In a distant corner, the bride was seen smiling. A smile thin as a strand of sky, passing as swiftly as a bird. On her wrists, a new rosary, a gift from an old nun of a frozen land, quietly reminded her that wherever she was, prayer was still the way to keep a heart from breaking aloud. In that look there was something new, no longer entirely ignorant, not yet fully ready, simply a person learning to stand firm on unfamiliar ground. You leave the ceremony to descend into the deeper layers, where politics waited like a trap. The court was split into two camps, those urging that good news must come quickly, for the kingdom needed an heir, those speaking gently of time to heal. Outside, anonymous woodcuts, ownerless rumors, biting songs, all circled the palace like crows waiting for prey. A failed wedding night, it turned out, was not just a matter of two people. It became an excuse for rivals to pluck another note on the discordant melody long in the making. The king responded with the habit he knew best, gathering power into one: new decrees. old faces pushed aside, loyal hands drawn closer. He knew the ancient rule when the doors inside the house would not open. One must lock the doors outside. Thus the air in Madrid grew heavier. But heaviest of all was still in the bridal chamber there. The two of them still had to find a common rhythm, though each carried a history of their own. Here, pause a moment to look wider. A dynasty is not only shaped by battles and treaties, it is also forged in small rooms, whispered conversations, evenings when someone decides to open their heart, or not, and at times, the fragile line between sacrament and power is stretched until it cracks. That wedding night was a crack. Through it, you can see what people usually avoid: the loneliness of one who has everything, the fear of one who has nothing but a title, and the invisible violence when a system lays the burden of lineage on the frail shoulders of a child barely grown. In the months that followed, the story shifted from private to public. In another form, negotiations about succession law, debates over the role of the church in royal life, deliberations on whether to alter or preserve tradition. People began to speak of a medical solution with words dry but safe caution required. Experts needed. Confidentiality kept. No one said love. That word always existed in the Forbidden Palace, but hidden in the vaulted ceilings, dropping only a few specks of dust when sunlight struck through. You imagine another room, no flowers, no candles, where a handful of physicians exchanged ideas, drew abstract diagrams, spoke of compatibility, vulnerability, ways to minimize risk. They chose words as one chooses stones for the foundation of a bridge, for they knew better than anyone. One wrong suggestion could lead to the right disaster, and in the scratching of pens, something faintly glimmered the hope that the dynasty might continue without repeating the horror of a certain night. On the other side, the bride grew older by the day. The original fear slowly retreated, making space for a quiet form of courage, the courage of one who knows she cannot choose her circumstances, but can choose how to stand within them. She began to learn the language of the court, to discern which gaze carried goodwill and which smile hid a trap. She learned to ask for time before answering, to lay her hand on the rosary as on her own heartbeat. And when facing the king, she stood straighter, spoke slower, even learned to smile, though thin as a thread. And the king, perhaps you will be surprised, power does not cure loneliness. It only hides it beneath layers of velvet. At some moment, when the choir had dispersed, when the footsteps of courtiers had faded, he too sat alone before the fire, staring at the flames and wondering why some doors closed tighter the harder you pushed. He was not a gentleman, but even the ungentle have moments of seeing the shadow within themselves. Only, to see does not mean to know how to change. One winter evening, when frost lay heavy on the stone balustrades, the king was seen leaving a banquet early. The bride had just stepped into the courtyard, pausing under an orange tree, heavy with fruit. By chance they met. No music, no ceremony. He said something very simple, an awkward apology. Perhaps? She nodded, neither rejecting nor forgiving, only nodding. That moment passed so quickly that no chronicle recorded it. But sometimes, it is the things unrecorded that save a day from sinking entirely into night. Time, no matter how slow, still flows. From wax-sealed letters to whispered conversations, from the sweat of physicians to the murmurs of wet nurses. The entire palace moved like a colossal machine with a single goal: succession. It cared not for rumors, nor for the rain falling on the domes. It measured only the ripeness of the moment. And when good news arrived or bad news repeated, it would ring its bells in a predetermined way. That was the most frightening and also the most comforting thing, an ancient mechanism still running on its rails. You returned to the bed, where one knight had once stamped shame, to see that it had fresh linens, the wooden frame polished, new orange blossoms filling the room with a light fragrance. Memory did not disappear. It merely sank to the bottom, becoming a sediment upon which ordinary days could be laid. And ordinary days, strangely, were the rarest miracles in the Forbidden Palace. There, the bride learned to embroider a flower. The king signed a decree with gentler words. The servant child carried tea without spilling a drop. Each of these things was small, yet together, they created a peaceful afternoon. From here, the story would move into harsher territories, the ancient laws regarding female heirs, the simmering disputes that could ignite wars if the throne remained uncertain, and the technical solutions, sounding cold, that once saved a dynasty from falling into the abyss of heirlessness. But before touching all of that, let the 16-year-old bride have one night of restful sleep, a night with no knocking on the door, no urgings, no prying eyes. Let the candle burn until only a tiny orange ember remained, and then extinguish itself. You close the chamber door with a quiet thought: power may write history, but only kindness can write peace. And sometimes, peace begins by calling fear by its true name, so that it leaves the chest like a night bird returning to the forest. Tomorrow, when the church bells ring, when carriages roll across the square, when delegations arrive again to pay respects, the story will continue. It will lead you through the message of Rome, the cold rules of succession law, the medical tragedies of a time without anesthesia, and the strange solution that changed the fate of the throne. But that is a story for another part. Tonight, you need only remember one thing behind the gilded surface. Human beings tremble as we do, and in the whispers of the Madrid night, there was a tiny prayer, enough to keep the heart of a young girl from breaking aloud. In the Palace of Madrid, news was never just news. It was threads of silk, each pulling along a web of speculation, calculation, and sometimes revenge. After that wedding night, the air in the palace thickened. Every glance exchanged along the long carpeted corridors carried an unspoken question. Would the king succeed? And more importantly, when would there be good news? Those closest to the throne understood that the answer would decide not only the fate of two people, but the key to the stability of the entire dynasty. If the new queen could not fulfill her sacred duty, those lurking in the shadows would swiftly turn rumor into weapon, opening the way for other candidates to ascend the throne. At court banquet, where the strings mingled with the soft clink of glasses, people still laughed, still danced, still toasted as if nothing were amiss. But if you listened carefully, between the dragging of shoes on marble and the rustling of silk skirts, you would hear half-joking, half-true exchanges. I hear the Queen spends more time in the chapel than in the King's chamber. Perhaps she is praying for a miracle. My lord. Such words, though light, when passing through dozens of ears, turned into arrows. And in the palace, arrows of words were sometimes more dangerous than swords of steel. Inside the harem, the Queen's attendants and the King's confidants began to keep their distance. Each group built around itself an invisible wall. Those walls were built of rumors, taunt of whispers, and sometimes of evidence carefully staged: a gift forgotten on the dressing table, a wilted petal fallen by the bed, or a scrap of paper with strange lines of prayer. The king, long accustomed to absolute obedience from subjects and courtiers, began to feel the one thing he hated most: doubt. Not doubt of his power remained intact, but doubt of his ability to accomplish what every king considered an obvious duty to sustain the royal bloodline. Pride and vanity, the two things that had nourished his nature all his life, now turned into a smouldering flame, slow but persistent, The Queen, by contrast, lived to a different rhythm. She still spent much of her time in the chapel, still conversed with nuns and trusted ladies in waiting. She was so cautious that every word was weighed, every look measured. At a banquet, she could smile sweetly at a count, then immediately turn and bow to a cardinal with perfect reverence. She knew well in this place. Gentleness was the best armor, but every armor has its gap. One afternoon, while walking in the orange grove with two maids, the Queen was suddenly stopped by an older noblewoman. Her voice was like a finely sharpened blade. "Your Majesty, the people are eager to hear the laughter of a little prince echo in the palace." The Queen smiled, gave no reply, but that very evening, a new rumor arose that the Queen avoided the king, that she refused her duty under the cover of religious devotion. Such a rumor, like every other, did not need to be true. It only needed to linger long enough to create pressure. Amid those undercurrents, a series of secret letters began to be exchanged, not between the Queen and the king, but between their advisors, and most importantly, with the Holy See. Those letters never used the word problem. Instead, they spoke of a condition, a delay, or a matter of concern. The language was so refined that if they fell into outside hands, they would seem no more than polite courtesies. But everyone involved understood that behind the elegant ink there was only one concern: how to break the distance between the two. In a secret council session, a cardinal gently suggested that the royal couple should leave Madrid for a summer residence in Aranjuez. The reason given was a change of air, but all understood it was a way to separate them from the crowd of rumors, hoping that nature and quiet might help them find another rhythm. And so, on a misty morning, the royal carriages left the palace. The wheels rolled slowly on the cobblestone road, leaving behind noisy Madrid, heading toward the countryside where rows of green birches welcomed them. But even if the scenery changed, what each carried in their hearts remained the same. At Aranjuez, the summer palace opened to a new rhythm of life: breakfasts on the veranda, horseback rides along the riverbank, and evenings when lamps were lit early to keep out the chill. The king, in a space with fewer rituals, became less tense. He began speaking with the Queen more often, not only about succession, but about her homeland, her years in the convent, the hymns she had known since childhood. The Queen, still cautious, responded a little, not with intimacy, but with patience. Yet all efforts still faced a greater barrier: the Queen's fear and the King's pride. They were two boulders. No one wished to move first, and each passing day only made them heavier. Back in the Madrid court, those who remained continued their game. Some hoped the king would soon announce good news, ending all speculation. Others longed for the opposite, for a prolonged failure could open the way to another marriage alliance, more advantageous for them. This polarization seeped even into seemingly trivial details: who was invited to which banquet, who sat near the Queen's table, who received the king's glance when entering the room. When spring returned, the royal carriages made their way back to Madrid. They were greeted with the same enthusiasm as when they departed, but every gaze quietly searched for some sign, a gesture, a smile, or simply an exchanged look between king and queen, to guess whether the holiday had succeeded. The answer, as always in the palace, did not come immediately. But the keen-eyed began to notice the king grew less angry when the Queen was mentioned. The Queen, instead of withdrawing to the chapel after each ceremony, sometimes stood a little longer beside the king, listening to him converse with ambassadors. Those small changes, fragile as they were enough to kindle new hope. Madrid entered summer, the heat clinging to every stone wall of the palace. In the long corridors, The sound of wooden clogs and the rustling of silk skirts grew slower, heavier, as if pressed by an invisible weight. That weight did not come from the air, but from a question hanging over everyone's head. When will there be an heir? Court sessions now often ended with hushed conversations in corners. A group of younger nobles whispered that if the queen did not fulfill her duty within a year, they would petition for another solution. The older, more conservative nobles replied that God will soon arrange it, but their eyes wandered into the void, as if they themselves did not believe the words they spoke. The Holy See, long observing, began to show impatience. From Rome, a letter was sent, bearing a red seal, emphasizing that it is God's will that the royal marriage bear fruit, and that the wife must embrace her role with devotion and faith. The words were exceedingly gentle, but each sentence struck like a hammer on the same spot. There was no more time for hesitation. The letter reached the king on a sunny morning. While he was receiving a group of merchants from Cadiz, he did not read it in their presence, but his face changed slightly, as if reminded of a debt he did not wish to pay. That very afternoon, the king summoned a private meeting with only his closest confidants, including the cardinal advisor and the royal physician. In that closed chamber, no one spoke directly of the failed wedding night. It was a forbidden subject. Instead, they discussed initial obstacles, differences in upbringing, and harmonizing solutions. The physician, a gaunt man with dark circles under his eyes from long nights studying medical texts, quietly suggested there might be need for a small technical intervention to help matters proceed smoothly and safely for the Queen. The word technical landed like a pebble dropped into a still pond. It suggested something unusual, a detour, yet carried such reasonableness that it was difficult to oppose. The king, prideful at any hint regarding his private life, remained silent for so long that the ticking of the pendulum clock filled the room. Then he nodded. If that ensures succession, then let it be considered. When this news reached the Queen, she said nothing. She only looked out the window, where lavender bushes swayed lightly in the summer breeze. She understood that in this world, her body was no longer entirely her own. It was the property of the dynasty, a machine expected to function at the right time. The technical intervention they spoke of sounded like a medical procedure, but in truth, it was part of a political strategy. In the days that followed, the royal physician began health examinations for both husband and wife. He observed, took notes, and made discreet suggestions with absolute caution. Meanwhile, the cardinal advisor drafted a report to the Holy See, affirming that every effort is being made to ensure that the royal marriage will bear fruit, according to God's will and the interests of the kingdom. Outside of this central matter, the palace continued its daily rituals, banquets to receive foreign guests, summer hunts in the outskirts, and religious festivals in which the Queen always took part with impeccable devotion. Yet the sharp-eyed noticed the king was less irritable when speaking of the Queen, and the Queen no longer avoided her husband's gaze. A small change, but enough for servants to whisper that perhaps everything is moving in the right direction. In a private meeting, the cardinal advisor gently said to the Queen, "Sometimes, Your Majesty, God's will is carried out through very human means. We pray, but we must also act." The Queen only gave a faint smile. That smile, to the discerning, was not absolute agreement, but her way of keeping a quiet space for herself amid the mounting pressures. When autumn arrived, the royal physician formally presented his solution, a supportive device, delicately designed, ensuring the Queen's safety while sparing the king's pride. The design was presented in an ebony box lined with red velvet. The physician explained its use in meticulous detail, but with language of utmost decorum. avoiding any coarse description. The king listened, silent for a long moment, then said, "If this is the path to keep the throne for my bloodline, then I accept." The queen also nodded, but in her heart, this was not an ordinary agreement. She knew that once she consented, there would be no turning back. Every eye in the court would be upon her, waiting for results. And if those results came, it would be a victory for the entire system, but also the end of the little freedom she still possessed. From then on, the palace entered a silent phase. No more noisy rumors. No more blunt questions. Only fleeting exchanges of glances among courtiers. Letters sent with briefer contents, and banquets where the smiles of king and queen seemed more in harmony. The Palace of Madrid, long accustomed to the clamour of intrigue, was now strangely quiet. And in that quiet, all knew that something important was being prepared. One late autumn evening, the queen appeared beside the king at a feast in honour of a martyred saint. She wore a deep blue gown, a small crown instead of the large one, and throughout the event, she did not leave her husband's side. It was the first public signal that their relationship had eased, and in the court, a signal meant more than any declaration. But outside the palace, opposing forces still waited for their chance. The king's brother, Don Carlos, who would have the right of succession if the throne had no direct heir, began to increase his meetings with the conservative faction. Promises of restoring order and protecting tradition were whispered across the countryside. They knew well each day that passed. Without the Queen's pregnancy was another day their hopes survived. And that was precisely why the palace had to act quickly. The royal physician, with the discreet cooperation of the Queen and the reluctant yet resolute consent of the King, began to implement the technical solution at the end of winter. Everything was kept so secret that even many within the royal household did not know. Only a very few, those absolutely loyal, were allowed near when it took place. In the months that followed, Madrid entered a new spring. The orange trees in the gardens bloomed white, their sweet fragrance drifting into the cold stone corridors. The Queen continued to appear regularly at ceremonies, but they were now organized with greater ease, so as not to tire her. The King, meanwhile, began to speak more often of the future of the kingdom, his tone more assured, and behind the scenes, the courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Perhaps, this time it would succeed. That spring, Madrid seemed to don a new cloak. The old elms in the royal park sprouted fresh shoots. Willows swayed like silk ribbons in the wind. And in the central square, flower sellers displayed pots of blazing red carnations. No one said it aloud, but the entire capital felt a certain light premonition, like before a summer storm when a sudden cool wind sweeps in. Inside the palace, faint but unmistakable signs began to appear. The Queen attended fewer banquets and ceremonies. When she did, she often chose to sit rather than stand for hours as before. Horse rides were cancelled without explanation. Her most trusted lady-in-waiting, once discreet to the point of silence, now appeared more guarded against the eyes of outsiders. Then one morning in early May, the great bells of Almudena Cathedral rang earlier than usual. The sound stretched long, slow, each toll measuring the heartbeat of the palace. The official news was announced the Queen was pregnant. The news spread like fire across a dry field. Churches hung flags. Guards at the palace gates donned red uniforms. And in cafes people clinked glasses as if celebrating a great victory. At court, counts, marquises, and envoys lined up to offer congratulations. Many sighed with relief, for the birth of an heir meant the court could avoid a succession crisis. But the joy inside the palace was not complete. Don Carlos, the king's brother, heard the news with a thin smile. He knew the child was not yet born and anything could still happen. In his private meetings with supporters, he reminded them, "We respect God's will, but we must prepare for every possibility." The king was different. For the first time in many years, he entered the council chamber with the face of a man sure of the future. He spoke of the stability of the kingdom, of a new generation of the Bourbon house, and, most importantly, of the duty to protect the succession of this bloodline, whether male or female. That final sentence left the room in silence. Everyone knew the Salic law, imported from France, had barred women from the Spanish throne for centuries. If the child were a girl, the throne would by default pass to Don Carlos. But the king, after so many years of waiting, refused to accept that prospect. From that moment, a plan began to take shape. In secret meetings, the king consulted royal lawyers and key members of the Council of State. They discussed a special decree, the Pragmatic Sanction, to abolish the Salic law and allow a daughter to inherit. Each meeting was held behind heavy doors, with guards posted firmly outside. The Queen, when she learned of her husband's intent, did not oppose it. She understood this was the only way to protect her child, whether boy or girl, but she also foresaw that such a decision would spark a political storm. For traditional royalists and supporters of Don Carlos would see it as betrayal. While the legal negotiations proceeded in secrecy, palace life was reshaped to protect the pregnancy. The royal physician scheduled regular examinations. The Queen's meals were specially prepared, and a discreet guard detail surrounded her residence. No one outside the circle of confidants was allowed direct access. Summer passed in an atmosphere of both hope and tension. Loyal subjects gathered before the gates to pray for a strong prince. But in the council halls, politicians knew well if it were a princess, the country would face a succession struggle not seen since the wars of the previous century. Finally, one morning in October, cannon fire thundered from the Madrid fortress, the traditional signal of royal good news. The Queen had delivered a healthy baby girl, Isabella. The city erupted in cheers. But in the shadows of politics, the reaction was very different. The faction of Don Carlos immediately gathered, declaring that the Salic law was still in force, and Isabella could not inherit. The king countered by signing the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, officially abolishing it. The decree was proclaimed before nobles and envoys. As the red wax seals were pressed down, all understood that the kingdom's future had turned. But at the same time, the seed of a civil war had been planted. Calls to defend tradition echoed through the countryside, where the Carlist faction, supporters of Don Carlos, held strong influence. In the palace, amid the congratulations, the Queen cradled her daughter, looking into the small face, and knew this child's life would not be peaceful. And the king, though proud, realized he had just opened a new battle, not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the nation. Soon after, this event would lead to the First Carlist War, a bloody conflict lasting many years and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. And it all began with a decision in the palace. The decision of a father who refused to see his daughter excluded from the throne he had waited for all his life. When Isabella II was born, Madrid still basked in the intoxication of festivals for the little princess. But in the northern provinces, especially Navarra, the Basque country, and Catalonia, the mood was very different. Churches there rang their bells not to celebrate, but to call for the defense of ancestral law. Public ceremonies swore loyalty to Don Carlos as acts of defiance. In early 1833, when the king fell gravely ill, the entire court trembled with rumors. Every cough, every sleepless night was noted and discussed. All understood if he died before Isabella was strong enough to stand, the throne would become a battlefield, On the 29th of September, Itenbabai Sanchosan, Ferdinand died. He left the throne to his 3-year-old daughter and a decree abolishing the Salic law. The next day, Queen Maria Cristina was proclaimed regent. She stood on the palace balcony, holding the little princess in her arms, looking down at the sea of people below. Cheers rose, but amid them there were strange silences, small groups who did not shout Isabella's name, but stood still, eyes gazing far away. Less than a month later, Don Carlos declared Isabella a usurper, and himself the rightful king. The First Carlist War erupted. This war was not only a military conflict, but a division at the very roots of Spanish society. On one side were the Isabelinos, reformists, concentrated in the large cities, merchants, and part of the army loyal to the crown. On the other were the Carlists, mountain peasants, conservative nobles, and the church in rural areas, who believed that the Salic law was God's will and unchangeable. Maria Cristina, long accustomed to court life, now had to learn how to command a war. She relied on young generals and sought support from England and France. The intervention of these powers helped Isabella keep Madrid, but in the countryside, the Carlists still controlled much territory. The war became a chain of bloody battles, long sieges, and cycles of retaliatory massacres. In the palace, Isabella grew up amid the echoes of war. From the time she could walk, she was used to seeing maps of military campaigns spread across her mother's desk, wax-sealed letters arriving daily, and fearful whispers about the situation in the north. Maria Cristina tried to preserve for her daughter the image of a royal childhood tutors in languages, arts, and religion, small gatherings to practice etiquette, specially made dresses. But even within the velvet and silk, war crept in. Some tutors vanished because their hometowns were occupied. Gifts from distant regions failed to arrive because roads were cut off. In 1839, after 6 years of bloodshed, a temporary treaty was signed, the Convention of Vergara. The Carlists agreed to lay down arms in exchange for retaining certain regional privileges. But this peace was as fragile as morning mist. The embers still burned, waiting to ignite. Maria Cristina, exhausted by war and political pressure, began to falter. She was discovered to have a secret relationship with a young guardsman, Agustin Fernando Muñoz, and even secretly married him. When this became public, her reputation collapsed. The opposition used it to paint her as a frivolous, unworthy regent. In 1840, under pressure from the army and the progressives, Maria Cristina was forced to resign the regency, ceding it to General Baldomero Espartero. She left Spain with Muñoz and their illegitimate children, leaving Isabella II, then only 10 years old, in the hands of people she did not trust. In 1843, at only 13, Isabella II was declared of age and formally crowned, largely because rival factions wanted to exploit a young, inexperienced queen. But from the start, her reign was overshadowed by her father's legacy. People still remembered her as the child born of a strange marriage, that her throne existed only because of a controversial decree. Every decision she made, however minor, was judged through that lens of the past. Isabella II, perhaps unintentionally, carried traits. Her father's critics often cited a mercurial temperament, scandalous romantic entanglements, and the capacity to alienate multiple factions at once. Her court became a nest of scandal, rumors of lovers, excessive favoritism towards certain advisors, and puzzling political choices. In 1868, after years of simmering discontent, a military political coalition launched the glorious revolution La Gloriosa. Rebel forces marched into Madrid, Isabella II was forced to abdicate and went into exile in France. At that moment, many saw a tragic circle. Ferdinand had fought his entire life to place his daughter on the throne. Yet her reign lasted only 25 years and ended in disgrace. The throne he left, after so much scheming, laws rewritten, and wars fought, slipped from the family's hands within his daughter's own lifetime. Today, historians often describe the era of Ferdinand and Isabella II as a textbook example of power won at any cost, but unsustainable without stability. The decision to alter the succession laws to place Isabella on the throne saved the crown in the short term, but also sowed the seeds of bloody wars and long-term collapse. In the history galleries of Madrid, you can see portraits of Ferdinand and Isabella hanging only a few steps apart. But if you stand between the two paintings and close your eyes, you can almost hear the echoes of war, of secret councils, of children's cries mingling with cannon fire, all of it beginning from a story inside the palace. From one night when the history of Spain turned down a road with no return, after Isabella II went into exile in France, it seemed as though the story of the Bourbons in Spain would close. But in reality, their shadow and the political wounds from Ferdinand's era continued to cling to the country. Spain entered a period of political chaos, military factions taking turns in power, coups following one after another, and the constitution being rewritten several times within a single decade. Behind each upheaval remained the same question: who was the legitimate heir? The Carlists, though defeated militarily, endured as a political and social force deeply rooted in the regions. In the deserted Palace of Madrid, portraits of Ferdinand and Maria Cristina were covered with cloth, but stories about them, especially the controversy over succession law, were still whispered among the nobility. Some saw Ferdinand as the protector of the bloodline, no matter the cost. Others called him the instigator of an unnecessary war. Isabella II, in Paris, continued to live as an exiled queen. She maintained a miniature court in her suburban villa, receiving former courtiers and distinguished guests. On autumn afternoons in Paris, as golden light spread across the streets, she would stroll through the garden with a few close friends. Recalling the years in Madrid, in those stories, her father's name always appeared, sometimes as pride, sometimes as lament. In 1870, under political and diplomatic pressure, Isabella officially abdicated in favor of her son, Alfonso XII, then only 13. But Spain at that time was not ready to welcome the Bourbons back. Instead, Parliament searched for a new king from other European dynasties, an effort to end the long conflict over succession. This power vacuum once again became an opportunity for the Carlists. In 1872, they launched the Third Carlist War, once more in the name of legitimate succession under the Salic law. The war dragged on until 1876, claiming tens of thousands of lives and devastating the countryside. Looking back, historians recognized without Ferdinand's pragmatic sanction of 1830, there would have been no reason for the two later Carlist wars. In Madrid, whenever news came of fighting in the north, people remembered the days of Ferdinand's reign, with all the strangeness, ruthlessness, and calculation that had laid the foundation for this age of turmoil. And then, the wheel of history turned. In 1874, after the failure of a short-lived republic, the Bourbons were restored to the throne through Isabella II's son, Alfonso XII. The day he returned to Madrid, cannons thundered again, and the national anthem rang out in the palace courtyard. But along with the joy of reunion, many whispered a question. Was this a new beginning? Or just another loop in the Bourbon tragedy? Alfonso XII, educated abroad, understood that if he wanted to keep the throne, he would have to repair the mistakes his grandfather and mother had left. He tried to build the image of a conciliatory king, seeking reconciliation with the Carlists and other political forces. Yet even after signing peace treaties, he could not erase the memory of the succession wars that began with Ferdinand's decision in a palace nearly half a century earlier. In the royal archives, the records of Ferdinand's time still lie in dark wooden cabinets. Whenever a historian requests access, they must sign pledges of confidentiality, especially regarding private letters and medical journals of the court. It is said that among those thousands of pages are detailed accounts of secret meetings, where the Holy See and physicians debated how to resolve the king's issue. Debates not only of medicine but also of power between throne and church. Some documents declassified in the late 20th century revealed that the Holy See had once considered proposing an alternative succession, allowing Ferdinand to adopt a child from another Bourbon branch, legitimizing it as his own, to avoid changing the Salic law, but Ferdinand firmly refused. Modern historians look at this and conclude he chose the difficult and bloody path solely to ensure that a child of his own blood sat on the throne, regardless of the consequences. You can see that even after a figure has died, their legacy continues to write the nation's story. Ferdinand is gone, but his shadow still hangs over every debate on succession, every Carlist war, and every reign that followed, even in the 21st century. When Spain is a constitutional monarchy, the change of succession law to allow women to inherit the throne still recalls the year 1830. The year Ferdinand abolished the Salic law for the sake of a child not yet born. And perhaps, if you stand before the gates of the Royal Palace in Madrid on an autumn evening, when golden light falls upon the ancient stone walls, you will feel that story is still there, not as a closed book, but as an old breath lingering through the corridors, where power and human destiny twist together in endless spirals. Maria Cristina, from regent to exile, after Ferdinand died in 1833. Maria Cristina became regent for her young daughter. In the first years, she proved a skillful ruler, balancing between conservatives and reformists. But the First Carlist War steadily eroded her authority. The hardest blow came from her private life. She secretly married Agustin Fernando Muñoz, a young guardsman of humble origin, only a few months after her husband's death. When this news broke, it caused outrage. A royal widow remarrying a man outside the nobility, while still serving as regent. The opposition used this scandal to attack her as improper, lacking dignity, and by extension, to question Isabella's legitimacy, pressed between political opposition and aristocratic disdain. Maria Cristina was forced to leave Spain in 1840, living in exile in France and Italy. She kept close contact with her daughter through letters, but her direct influence in politics was over. Isabella II, a queen in the storm. Isabella ascended the throne at just 13, with almost no governing experience. From the start, her court was the arena where military and political factions competed for influence. Every decision she made was scrutinized not only because she was a woman, but because she was the product of her father's controversial 1830 decree. Isabella II quickly gained notoriety for her complicated private life. Numerous relationships, both official and unofficial, were turned into political weapons. Opponents labelled her the queen of favours and personal whims, implying she granted posts and privileges based on affection rather than merit. Under her reign, Spain was plagued by political crises, coups, constitutional changes, colonial wars in Cuba and Morocco. The instability made many trace the roots back had it not been for Ferdinand and the succession conflict. Perhaps the country would not have fallen into this spiral. Finally, the glorious revolution of 1868 forced Isabella to abdicate. She fled to France, living in Paris as an exiled queen. retaining royal manners but stripped of power. In her later years, she spent much time in convents and charity, perhaps trying to atone for her lost image. Alfonso XII, a short-lived Hope Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, was restored to the throne in 1874 after the failure of a brief republic. Alfonso, educated in England and Austria, understood that if he wanted to hold the crown, he had to do what his grandfather and mother could not: stabilize the country and reduce divisions. He pursued reconciliation with the Carlists, ending the Third Carlist War in 1876, while consolidating the constitutional monarchy. For a brief time, Spain enjoyed relative calm, the Bourbon Restoration. But Alfonso XII reigned only a short while. He died of tuberculosis in 1885 at the age of 27. His early death convinced many that the curse from Ferdinand's era still haunted the Bourbons. This throne would never remain at peace for long. Alfonso XIII, king from the womb, when Alfonso XII died. His queen, Maria Christina of Austria, was pregnant. 9 months later, Alfonso XIII was born and instantly became king, one of history's rare cases of a king from the womb. Maria Christina, a distant relative of Maria Christina of Naples. Ferdinand's wife served as regent until her son came of age. Alfonso XIII's reign began with promise, but soon descended into turmoil. The disastrous Spanish-American War of 1898, which cost Spain most of its colonies, internal political crises, and, eventually, widespread discontent that opened the way for Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. In 1931, Alfonso XIII was forced to abdicate and go into exile when the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. Once again, the Bourbons lost the throne, this time to a republican wave stronger than ever. A legacy lasting over a century, from Ferdinand to Alfonso XIII. The story repeated itself. The Bourbon throne defended at all costs, even by rewriting laws and waging wars. But those very actions creating long-term instability. Historians call this the succession fracture, a crack born from a single decision in the palace in 1830, stretching across 3 centuries, fueling at least 3 civil wars, 4 losses of the throne, and countless exiles. Today, many look back and find it ironic. All of it began with a physically impaired king, obsessed with producing an heir at any cost, and a wedding night that turned into disaster. From that moment on, every generation of his descendants paid the price, in war, in exile, or in reigns too short and troubled to endure. Paris, a palace without a throne for an exiled queen. In the Paris winter of 1868, as the last leaves fell from the Champs-Élysées, a quiet carriage entered the city. Inside the large coach, draped with blue velvet curtains, sat Isabella II, the queen who had just lost her throne. There were no cavalry escorts, no cannon salutes, only a few loyal courtiers following behind. She chose to live in a villa on Avenue Kleber, near the Trocadero Square. The house was not as grand as the Madrid palace, but it was decorated to evoke a trace of lost glory. Old Persian carpets from the Royal Palace, a collection of Bourbon ancestral portraits, and even silver candlesticks once used in royal ceremonies. Each morning, Isabella stepped onto the balcony to look toward the Seine, where winter fog blanketed the water. Even in exile, she maintained her elaborate rituals of dress-embroidered gowns, hair pinned high, pearl jewelry. A queen must never dress like an anonymous widow, she often told her ladies-in-waiting. A miniature court in the Paris villa. Isabella maintained a miniature court each afternoon. The main salon opened to guests former Spanish nobles, disgraced politicians, French journalists, and even unofficial agents of Madrid. She sat on a high chair covered in red velvet, with the Bourbon flag behind her, and received visitors according to old court etiquette: a nod of the head, a hand extended for a kiss, and a few formal questions before the real matters began. People came not only out of respect, but because this place was a center of news, stories never printed in papers, the latest rumors from Spain, and sometimes secret deals. Her dinner parties became famous in the exile community: long tables draped in white linen, silver cutlery engraved with fleur-de-lis, deep red Rioja wine poured from unlabeled bottles, gifts from secret supporters. Amid clinking glasses, conversations drifted from Parisian art to Spanish politics, from winter fashions to rumors of the Carlists. Influence from afar, even in Paris. Isabella never fully left Spanish politics. She maintained a network of former officials, loyal military officers, and noble families who owed her favors. Through them, she received detailed reports on political developments, rising figures, and opportunities that might restore the Bourbons. She wrote by hand, on thin cream paper, with pale blue ink, her script neat and slanted. In the letters, she carefully expressed concern about decisions of the new government, but beneath the surface were instructions for her supporters. Many letters were routed through Belgium or Italy to avoid interception. More than once, she succeeded in exerting pressure from afar. Some ministers in Madrid were forced to resign after the French press suddenly published critical exposés. Articles later revealed to have originated from information Isabella herself had provided to sympathetic journalists. The presence of the Carlists. Ironically, in Paris, Isabella also met with certain Carlist figures, the very people who had opposed her and supported Don Carlos. These meetings were never public, held in a small upstairs room, behind thick curtains and locked doors. The aim was not full reconciliation, but to explore the possibility of tactical alliances. If Spain's situation shifted, she understood well that today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally, and vice versa. Yet she never forgot that it was the Carlist movement that had plunged her childhood and youth into war. Personal life in Paris. Beyond politics, Isabella took part in Parisian social life. She appeared at the Opera Garnier, at exhibitions in the Louvre, and occasionally attended soirees hosted by Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, and herself of Spanish origin. On such occasions, Parisian newspapers often described her as a queen without a throne, yet still radiating royal dignity. Yet Isabella also lived many years in solitude. Her children grew up in various countries, some serving in foreign armies. She often wrote to them, recalling Madrid, the orange groves of Aranjuez, and the day of return, though she knew that day might never come. The final years and legacy in Paris. Isabella lived in Paris until the end of her life, returning to Spain only for rare family occasions. She died in 1904 and was buried at El Escorial, the traditional resting place of Spanish monarchs. In Paris, her villa was later sold, but many of its furnishings, velvet chairs, ancestral portraits, silver cutlery, were preserved as relics of the palace without a throne. For many Spanish exiles, it was a place where they felt a fleeting warmth of homeland, even as they knew that homeland had been forever changed since Ferdinand's time. When Isabella II died in Paris in 1904, she had spent more than 3 decades in exile, witnessing the Bourbon throne seized, restored, and shaken again. Yet her influence on the dynasty did not end there. It passed on to her son, Alfonso XII, once regarded as the last hope to reunite a country divided by her grandfather's decision. Alfonso XII, the reconciler in the shadow of the past. In 1874, after the turbulent years of the First Spanish Republic, The army decided to restore the Bourbons. Alfonso XII, then 17, returned from England and Austria, where he had been thoroughly educated in both military and political affairs. The day he set foot in Madrid, crowds filled the streets to greet him as if welcoming back a long-lost son. But behind the applause, old hostilities lingered. The Carlists, though twice defeated, still refused to recognize the legitimacy of a dynasty born of the 1830 decree. Alfonso understood that without reconciliation, the wound would never heal. He negotiated to end the Third Carlist War in 1876, signing an agreement that preserved certain regional privileges for the rebellious provinces. At the same time, he consolidated the constitutional monarchy, creating a system of two alternating parties to prevent endless coups. For a few short years, Alfonso brought relative stability, but Ferdinand's shadow still loomed whenever conservatives felt their interests threatened. They would remind everyone that this dynasty exists only thanks to an untraditional decree. In 1885, Alfonso XII died of tuberculosis at the age of 27. His early death plunged the nation into uncertainty once again, and the fracture of succession reappeared. Alfonso XIII, the king from the womb. When Alfonso XII died, Queen Maria Cristina of Austria was pregnant. On May 17, she gave birth to a son, who instantly became Alfonso XIII, a king born in the womb. Maria Cristina became regent, much like her predecessor Maria Cristina of Naples nearly half a century earlier. She governed with caution, striving to balance factions, and above all, to safeguard the throne for her son against any challenge related to the old succession law. But the times had changed. Spain entered the 20th century with mounting problems, a lagging economy, independence movements in Cuba and the Philippines, and competition with other empires. In 1898, under Maria Cristina's regency, Spain lost the Spanish-American War, surrendering Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It was the greatest shock to the nation since the loss of its Latin American colonies, and it gravely damaged the monarchy's prestige. The reign of Alfonso XIII, a train without brakes. Alfonso XIII formally assumed power in 1902, at just 16. At first, he was expected to lead Spain into modernization, but his impulsive personality and his tendency to meddle directly in politics put him in constant conflict with governments. In the early years of his reign, Alfonso XIII tried to build the image of a close, approachable king, appearing frequently in public and participating in social causes. However, he soon became infamous for a scandalous private life and risky political decisions. The war in Morocco 1909-1927 dragged on, costly and divisive. In 1923, as the country slid into political crisis, Alfonso XIII supported the coup of General Primo de Rivera, establishing a military dictatorship. At first, this brought temporary stability, but when the regime collapsed in 1930, the king's credibility collapsed with it. In 1931, amid a rising Republican tide, Alfonso XIII was forced to leave Spain without formally abdicating. Once again, the Bourbons were in exile, the same cycle since Ferdinand's time, a fracture lasting over a century from Ferdinand to Alfonso XIII. The story repeated like a refrain asterisk. The controversial succession decree of 1830. Asterisk successive Carlist wars. Asterisk monarchs trying to consolidate the throne, yet undermined by its fragile foundations. Asterisk exiles, restorations, and exiles again. Modern historians look back and see clearly Ferdinand's pragmatic sanction, a calculation to protect his daughter and his direct bloodline, saved the crown in the short term, but left a structural fracture that was never fully healed. Every successor, strong or weak, had to face the ghost of that decision. After Alfonso XIII left Spain in 1931, the Republic was proclaimed, but it did not remain peaceful. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted between the Republicans and the nationalists of General Francisco Franco. The war lasted 3 years, devastated the nation, and by 1939, Franco emerged as military dictator. Franco formally abolished the monarchy, but did not declare a republic. Instead, he ruled as head of state with full powers, while reserving the right to choose a future heir if the monarchy were restored. It was a calculated move. Franco wanted to ensure that any returning king would follow his political path. The Bourbons went into exile once more. Alfonso XIII died in Rome in 1941. His son, Don Juan de Borbón, became the nominal heir, but Franco distrusted him for his liberal views. Juan Carlos, Franco's pawn Franco, decided to skip over Don Juan and chose his son, Juan Carlos, as the potential heir. The reasoning was clear. Juan Carlos had been sent to Spain as a child, raised under Franco's guardianship and education, to become a compliant king who would continue the regime. In 1969, Franco officially named Juan Carlos successor to the throne when the monarchy was restored, with the title Prince of Spain. This was a major turning point for the first time in 38 years. The monarchy was set to return, but under the shadow of a dictator. 1975. Restoration of the monarchy. On the 20th of November, 1975, Franco died. 2 days later, Juan Carlos, I was proclaimed King of Spain. The world assumed he would continue the path of dictatorship, but Juan Carlos quickly surprised everyone. He initiated the process of democratization, legalized political parties, and led the country toward free elections. The image of Juan Carlos I in the 1972nd, 1982nd was that of a liberator king, the one who transformed Spain from a dictatorship into a modern constitutional monarchy. His prestige reached its peak after the coup attempt of the 23rd of February, 1978, when he appeared on national television in military uniform, calling on the army to defend the constitution. The ghost of the past, however, even though Juan Carlos succeeded in re-establishing the role of the Bourbons, the fracture from Ferdinand's time still lingered in Spain's political memory. Asterisk Republicans continued to argue that the monarchy lacked solid foundations, since it had always been tied to imposed decisions such as the 1830 decree or Franco's choice. Asterisk. In regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country, memories of the Carlist wars, born from disputes over succession, remained symbols of resistance to Madrid. These tensions simmered for decades, waiting to erupt when the monarchy faltered. That moment came in the early 21st century, when Juan Carlos was engulfed in financial scandals and controversies over his private life, forcing him to abdicate in 2014. Felipe VI, a cautious reign. His successor was his son, Felipe VI, who is still the current king of Spain. Felipe ascended the throne at a time when the monarchy's reputation was badly damaged by scandals. He chose a cautious style, reducing royal expenses and striving to project integrity. Even so, polls show that the monarchy remains divisive. Many support it as a symbol of stability, but many others prefer a republic. Here the story circles back to its origin. The foundations of this monarchy have never been fully secured since Ferdinand's 1830 decision, a spiral nearly 2 centuries, long from Ferdinand VII, who signed the decree abolishing the Salic law so his daughter could inherit to Isabella II. Overthrown and exiled to Alfonso. The 12th died young to Alfonso XIII, exiled after the Republican wave, to civil war and Franco, who bypassed the rightful heir to choose Juan Carlos to Juan Carlos. I restored the monarchy, but abdicated amid scandal to Felipe VI, cautiously holding the throne amid division. This chain of events has stretched nearly 2 centuries, yet revolves around a single nucleus, a succession decision born of personal obsession, placing family interest above traditional law, which created a fragile political condition for the entire Bourbon dynasty. When you stand before the Royal Palace of Madrid on a late afternoon, the golden light sweeping across the stone walls, it is hard to imagine that within these halls once echoed a failed wedding night, the beginning of a chain of upheavals that reshaped the fate of an entire dynasty. From Ferdinand VII abolishing the Salic law for an unborn daughter, to Isabella II growing up amid the cannon fire of the Carlist Wars, to Alfonso XII, trying to mend the nation only to die too soon, to Alfonso XIII, abandoning the throne in the Republican tide, to Juan Carlos I, restoring the monarchy and Felipe VI, striving to hold it in the 21st century. All are notes in a symphony spanning nearly 2 centuries, resonating from a single discordant note in 1830. The pragmatic sanction, when Ferdinand signed it, may have seemed to him only a survival move for his bloodline, but history rarely overlooks such changes. It created a fracture in the legal foundation of the Spanish monarchy, a fracture never fully healed. Every king thereafter had to walk on cracked stone, and every political shock, every social crisis, widened it further. The irony is that successors, whether strong or weak, skillful or clumsy, remained bound to the story Ferdinand had written. Even Juan Carlos I, once hailed as the king of democracy, still lived with the fact that his throne existed through 2 acts of imposition, one from Ferdinand, one from Franco, and Felipe VI. Today, still inherits both that legacy and that burden. From afar, this chain of events looks like a spiral: exile, return, exile again, succession wars, reconciliation, then renewed conflict. Each moment of apparent stability, followed by fresh upheaval. One may debate whether this was destiny, political consequence, or mere historical coincidence. But it is hard to deny that the first seed was sown on an autumn night in 1819, when a young bride clutched her rosary in fear. A king bore his defect and his obsession, and a royal marriage became a scar that would never fully heal. Today, visitors passing the gates of the royal palace may see only a monument, a photo backdrop, a relic of old stories. But if you listen closely, in the wind sweeping across the square, you may still hear distant echoes, whispers of secret councils, the hoofbeats of Carlist riders, cannon fire saluting returning kings, and the sighs of those who once left their homeland, all blend together, telling an old lesson every generation must relearn, that power, without firm foundations, will always be a drifting vessel in the current of history. And so, Ferdinand's story did not end with his death, but continues to live on in every decision, every controversy, and every succession of Spain. A reminder that sometimes an entire dynasty can be haunted for centuries by a single wedding night.